My name is Sage Mirren, and for 17 years, my family treated my seizures like temper tantrums. Now they're desperately calling with apologies after a neurologist's diagnosis proved everything they dismissed was catastrophically real. Funny how a medical degree can suddenly validate 17 years of suffering they chose to ignore.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're a subscriber, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Tell us a duh.
Before we dive into this journey, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story resonates with you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've got another medical gaslighting story that will absolutely shock you. I'm sitting in my office at the Denver Neurological Institute, where I now work as a patient advocate coordinator, staring at an email from my mother, Cordelia. The subject line reads, "Family Healing Session Request." I almost laugh at the irony. 3 years ago, she wouldn't even drive me to the emergency room during what she called one of my episodes. Today, she's suggesting family therapy to work through our misunderstandings about your condition. Misunderstandings, as if 17 years of medical neglect was just a simple communication breakdown. The glass walls of my office showcase the patient advocacy program I've built from nothing. 23 patients this month alone have received proper neurological evaluations after being dismissed by their families or primary care doctors. The program that my family said I'd never have the focus to maintain now serves as a model for hospitals across Colorado. My assistant, Marlo Thompson, knocks gently on the door. "Your 2 o'clock is here," she says, placing a fresh coffee on my desk. "The journalist from Medical Justice Quarterly wants to discuss your advocacy work." "Thanks, give me 5 minutes," I say, my finger hovering over the delete button on Cordelia's email. As Marlo leaves, I swivel my chair to face the floor-to-ceiling windows. The Rocky Mountains stretch endlessly before me, a testament to the possibilities I never imagined during those dark years when my own family convinced me I was broken. Growing up in suburban Minneapolis, I was the medical mystery in the Mirren family. My parents, Thaddeus and Cordelia, had 2 other children who followed perfectly predictable health patterns. My older brother Caspian was the golden child, star athlete, honor roll student, now completing his residency in orthopedic surgery. My younger sister Isadora was the creative one, dealing with typical teenage drama, but nothing that couldn't be solved with a guidance counselor session. And then there was me, the girl whose body would suddenly betray her in the middle of algebra class, during family dinners, at soccer practice. The episode started when I was 8, sudden moments where the world would shift, sounds would become muffled, and I'd lose awareness for anywhere from 30 seconds to several minutes. My family had a name for these episodes long before any doctor did: Sage's dramatic moments. Later, it evolved into attention-seeking behavior. By high school, they'd settled on calling them my little performances. "She's always been the emotional one," my mother would explain to concerned teachers, her voice carrying that particular blend of exasperation and embarrassment that became the soundtrack to my childhood. "Drama runs in my side of the family. My sister was the same way at that age." The comparison to my Aunt Vivian, who had struggled with anxiety and depression, became the family's go-to explanation for anything involving my brain that they couldn't immediately understand. Seizure-like episodes? Anxiety. Confusion after the episodes? Seeking attention. The headaches that followed? Clearly psychosomatic. My father, a pragmatic insurance adjuster who valued evidence and documentation above all else, took a different but equally dismissive approach. "If it was really medical, the doctors would have found something by now," he'd say whenever I begged for another specialist consultation. "We've spent enough money on wild goose chases." By the time I was 12, I'd seen 3 pediatricians, 2 family doctors, and 1 psychiatrist. Each appointment followed the same pattern. My parents would describe my behavioral episodes while I sat silently, having learned that any attempt to describe the actual physical sensations I experienced would be dismissed as adding dramatic details. The doctors, presented with a family's unified narrative of attention-seeking behavior and a patient who had learned to stay quiet, would nod sympathetically and suggest therapy, stress management techniques, or adjustments to my high-strung personality. Dr. Pemberton Hayes, our long-term family physician, became particularly influential in shaping my family's perspective. A traditional doctor in his 60s who believed strongly in parental authority, he would speak directly to my parents during appointments as if I wasn't in the room. Some children develop these patterns as a way of managing family stress, he'd explain, his tone suggesting that my episodes were somehow a reflection of poor parenting that needed to be corrected through firmer boundaries. Consistency in response is key. Don't reward the behavior with excessive attention or concern. This became the family policy. Ignore the episodes, minimize their impact, and certainly don't let Sage think they were anything more than behavioral issues that she could control if she really wanted to. The school nurse, Miss Winifred Blackwell, tried to advocate for me during my freshman year of high school when the episodes became more frequent and began affecting my academic performance. She'd witnessed several episodes firsthand and noted details that my family consistently overlooked: the way my hands would move involuntarily, how my eyes would track strangely during episodes, the genuine confusion I displayed afterward. "I really think Sage needs to see a neurologist," she told my parents during a conference call I wasn't invited to join but overheard from the hallway outside my mother's home office. "What I'm observing doesn't look like anxiety or attention-seeking behavior." My mother's response, delivered in that calm but firm tone she used when dismissing inconvenient suggestions, shut down the conversation quickly. "Miss Blackwell, I appreciate your concern, but we've been dealing with Sage's episodes for years. Multiple doctors have confirmed these are behavioral patterns. We're working with a therapist to address the underlying issues." The therapist she referenced, Dr. Marcus Webb, had seen me exactly 3 times and spent most of our sessions trying to uncover what family trauma might be causing my conversion symptoms. When I couldn't produce evidence of abuse, neglect, or dramatic family dysfunction, he seemed disappointed, as if my perfectly typical middle-class family problems weren't sufficient to justify my symptoms. "Sometimes," he explained to my parents in a session I wasn't supposed to hear, "young people create physical symptoms as a way of expressing emotional needs they can't articulate. The episodes serve a purpose in the family system." This explanation satisfied my parents completely. It positioned my episodes not as a medical mystery requiring investigation, but as a psychological problem with a clear solution. Stop enabling the behavior, maintain firm boundaries, and eventually I'd learn more appropriate ways to seek attention. The tragedy wasn't just that they were wrong about the medical reality of my condition. The tragedy was how thoroughly their dismissal shaped my own understanding of my body, my needs, and my right to advocate for my own health. By 16, I had internalized their narrative so completely that I began to question my own experiences. Maybe the strange sensations, the loss of awareness, the post-episode confusion were somehow under my control. Maybe I was subconsciously creating these frightening moments for reasons I didn't understand. This self-doubt would persist for years, even as the episodes grew more frequent and more severe, even as they began to impact every aspect of my life. I had learned to minimize my own suffering so effectively that I almost missed the moment when everything finally changed. The email from my mother sits unopened on my screen, a reminder of how dramatically our relationship has shifted since Dr. Amara Okafor finally gave me the words to explain what my body had been trying to tell us for 17 years. I'm no longer the girl whose medical reality was dismissed as teenage drama. I'm Sage Mirren, patient advocate, and for the first time in my life, I don't need my family's permission to trust my own experience. The Mirren family operated like a well-oiled machine, with each member occupying a clearly defined role that had been established over years of careful family choreography. At the head sat my father Thaddeus, a man whose entire worldview had been shaped by 32 years in the insurance industry. He approached every situation with an adjuster's eye for evidence, documentation, and measurable outcomes. If something couldn't be quantified, categorized, or easily explained, it fell into his mental file marked "requires further investigation," and further investigation in his mind was often not worth the time or expense. My mother Cordelia complemented his systematic approach with her own brand of social perfectionism. As the director of volunteer services for our suburban hospital, she had cultivated an image of competent family management that she protected fiercely. Every aspect of our family life was carefully curated to project success, stability, and appropriate normalcy.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Medical mysteries, unexplained symptoms, and unpredictable episodes didn't fit the narrative she'd constructed about the Mirren family's place in our community. People talk, she would remind us, whenever any family issue threatened to become public knowledge. Your father's position at the insurance company, my role at the hospital, we represent certain standards. We can't afford to have people thinking we can't manage our own household. This philosophy shaped every decision about how to handle my episodes from the very beginning. Private struggles were acceptable, even expected. Public scenes, medical consultations that might raise questions, or any suggestion that the Mirren family couldn't independently resolve our problems were absolutely unacceptable. My brother Caspian held the coveted position of golden child, though he wore the title with a complicated mixture of pride and burden. At 22, he was everything our parents had envisioned when they'd planned their family. Athletic enough to earn a partial scholarship to the University of Minnesota, academically gifted enough to maintain a 3.8 GPA in pre-med, socially skilled enough to serve as student body treasurer, and mature enough to be trusted with increasingly adult responsibilities from an early age. But Caspian's success came with an unspoken price. He was expected to be the family's proof of concept. Every achievement validated our parents' approach to child-rearing. Every award or recognition reflected their superior guidance. He absorbed this pressure by becoming hyper-competent, taking on responsibilities that extended far beyond his own life into managing family dynamics. Sage is having one of her episodes became a phrase he'd learned to handle with smooth efficiency. During family gatherings, he'd quietly redirect conversations away from my medical issues. At school events, he'd position himself strategically to intervene if I showed signs of an episode coming on. He genuinely believed he was protecting me, but his well-intentioned management also reinforced the family's narrative that my episodes were something to be handled, controlled, and minimized rather than investigated. My younger sister Isadora occupied the more comfortable middle ground of being the creative one. At 16, she'd found her niche in theater and visual arts, spaces where emotional intensity was not only acceptable but celebrated. Her dramatic tendencies were channeled into productive outlets, leading roles in school plays, award-winning paintings, poetry that won state competitions. Izzy's creative success provided the perfect contrast to my own unexplained episodes. When I would have an episode during dinner, losing awareness and sometimes making involuntary movements, the family could point to Izzy's controlled emotional expression as evidence of healthy ways to channel intensity. "Look how Izzy handles her feelings," my mother would say. "She puts them into her art instead of disrupting family time." The comparison wasn't malicious, but it was constant and deeply damaging. Every episode I had was implicitly measured against Izzy's ability to manage her emotions appropriately. Every moment of post-episode confusion was compared to her clarity of purpose and expression. The family's social circle reinforced these dynamics perfectly. Our neighbors, the Hendersons, had a daughter with diagnosed anxiety who'd learned to manage her symptoms through therapy and medication. "See how well Michelle is doing now that she's taking responsibility for her mental health," my father would observe whenever we encountered them at community events. The implication was always clear. Michelle had found appropriate solutions because her family had taken the right approach. If I wasn't improving, it must be because I wasn't taking similar responsibility. My parents' friends included several medical professionals who provided casual validation for their approach to my episodes. Dr. Patricia Vance, an emergency room physician who played tennis with my mother, would offer offhand observations about teenage conversion disorders at dinner parties. "It's so common," she'd say, gesturing with her wine glass. "These young people create physical symptoms to express psychological distress. The key is not to reinforce the behavior." These conversations, which I was sometimes present for but never invited to participate in, created an echo chamber that strengthened my parents' conviction that their approach was not only correct but professionally endorsed. The extended family added another layer of complicated dynamics. My grandmother Estelle, my father's mother, had always been quietly observant during family gatherings. She was the one person who seemed to notice details others missed, who would ask gentle questions about how I was feeling after episodes, who never seemed satisfied with the standard explanations about attention-seeking behavior. But her gentle concerns were consistently overruled by my Uncle Donovan, my father's brother, who worked as a school psychologist and considered himself the family expert on behavioral issues. Teenagers can be incredibly sophisticated in their manipulation, he would explain during holiday gatherings, his professional credentials lending weight to his dismissive assessments. The key is maintaining consistent boundaries and not rewarding problematic behavior with excessive attention. Uncle Donovan's professional opinion carried enormous weight with my parents, who felt validated having their approach endorsed by someone with actual training in psychology. His yearly visits became informal family therapy sessions, where my episodes were discussed, analyzed, and ultimately dismissed as manageable behavioral issues that would resolve with proper handling. The family's religious community provided the final pillar of support for their narrative. We attended Riverside Presbyterian Church, where Pastor Matthews frequently preached about the power of faith to overcome challenges and the importance of not claiming victim status when faced with difficulties. "God doesn't give us more than we can handle," was his frequent refrain, one that my parents applied liberally to my situation. The implication was that my episodes were somehow a test of faith, a challenge that could be overcome through proper spiritual discipline and positive thinking. Prayer became another tool in the family arsenal for managing my condition, not prayer for healing or medical wisdom, but prayer for strength to overcome these behavioral patterns and wisdom to stop seeking attention through negative means. This comprehensive support system, professional, social, religious, and familial, created an environment where questioning the established narrative about my episodes was not just difficult, but seemed almost morally wrong. Everyone agreed. I was a teenager with behavioral issues that could be resolved through appropriate discipline, therapy, and maturity. The fact that none of their approaches worked, that my episodes continued and even intensified over time, was attributed not to misdiagnosis, but to my own resistance to getting better. I wasn't trying hard enough, wasn't committed to change, wasn't taking responsibility for my own healing. By the time I was 15, this interpretation had become so entrenched that I began to believe it myself. The nickname started with what my family thought was humor. It was my 10th birthday party, and my mother Cordelia had spent weeks planning what she called the perfect celebration. The theme was princesses, complete with pink tablecloths, tiara party favors, and a custom cake shaped like a castle. 15 of my classmates were scattered around our backyard, playing games and laughing in the May sunshine. Everything was going exactly as planned until it wasn't. I remember the moment clearly because it happened right as my mother was lighting the candles on my birthday cake. The familiar sensation began in my stomach, a rising feeling like an elevator dropping too fast. The sounds around me became muffled, as if someone had wrapped cotton around my ears. The bright Minnesota sunlight seemed to dim, and the faces of my friends began to blur at the edges. "Sage?" My friend Emma's voice sounded like it was coming from underwater. "Are you okay?" I tried to respond, but the words wouldn't form properly. My body felt disconnected from my mind, like I was watching myself from somewhere far away. My hands began to move without my permission, my fingers twitching in patterns I couldn't control. The episode lasted maybe 90 seconds, but to everyone watching, it felt much longer. When awareness returned, I was sitting on the ground with 15 pairs of eyes staring at me in confusion and concern. My mother had rushed over, her face flushed with embarrassment as she knelt beside me. "I'm sorry, everyone," she announced with forced cheerfulness, her voice carrying that particular strain of a hostess managing an unexpected crisis. "Sage just got a little overwhelmed with all the excitement. Sometimes she gets dramatic when she's the center of attention." The word dramatic hung in the air like smoke. Several parents had arrived early to pick up their children, having been called by other parents who'd witnessed the episode. I could hear fragments of their whispered conversations. Seizure-like, should call an ambulance, has this happened before? My father Thaddeus appeared at my side, his insurance adjuster instincts kicking in as he assessed the situation with clinical efficiency. "She's fine," he announced to the gathering crowd. This happens sometimes when she gets overstimulated. We've had her checked out by doctors. This was technically true. I had been seen by our family physician, Dr. Pemberton Hayes, who had suggested the episodes were likely anxiety-related and recommended monitoring rather than immediate intervention. But the way my father presented it made it sound like we had a comprehensive medical understanding of my condition, when in reality we had only one doctor's preliminary opinion. Later that evening, after the last guest had departed and the party decorations had been packed away, my family held their post-mortem discussion in the kitchen. I was supposed to be upstairs getting ready for bed, but their voices carried clearly through the old house's thin floors. "That was mortifying," my mother said, her composure finally cracking now that we were alone. "Right in front of the Hendersons and the Washingtons. I spent 2 hours on the phone this afternoon fielding calls from concerned parents." "She picked quite a moment for one of her performances," my brother Caspian observed with the casual cruelty that only siblings can master. He was 12 then, old enough to understand that something was wrong with me, but young enough to resent the attention my episodes drew away from normal family activities. "It wasn't a performance," my sister Izzy protested, though her voice held uncertainty. At 8, she was the only one who consistently showed concern for me during episodes, but even she was beginning to absorb the family narrative that my behavior was somehow voluntary. "Of course it was," my father said, with the finality of someone who'd made a professional determination. "Think about the timing, right when she was supposed to blow out her candles, when all eyes were on her anyway. Classic attention-seeking behavior." My mother made a sound of frustrated agreement. "Dr. Hayes warned us this might happen. He said some children escalate their symptoms when they realize they're getting sympathy. We can't keep rewarding this behavior." That's when my Uncle Donovan's voice joined the conversation. He'd stayed late to help clean up, and his psychology background made him the family's unofficial expert on my condition. "I've seen this pattern in my work," he said with professional authority. "The child creates increasingly dramatic episodes to maintain their special status in the family system. The key is consistency. Don't give her the reaction she's seeking." "So what do we call it?" Caspian asked, "when she has these episodes?" There was a pause, and then my uncle's voice again, tinged with the kind of clinical humor that mental health professionals sometimes use to distance themselves from difficult cases. "Well, she certainly knows how to put on a show. Maybe we should call her our little drama queen." Laughter followed, not mean-spirited exactly, but the kind of familial teasing that establishes hierarchy and roles. My mother's voice carried relieved amusement as she refined the concept. "Drama queen sage," she said, trying out the phrase. "It has a ring to it." By the next morning, it had been shortened to just drama queen, and within a week, it was simply DQ, a nickname that sounded almost affectionate when said quickly, but carried the full weight of their dismissal when you understood its origins. The name stuck in the way that family nicknames do, becoming so normalized that no one questioned its impact on me. When I'd have an episode at dinner, someone would sigh and say, "There goes DQ again." When teachers called with concerns about my episodes at school, my parents would explain with weary familiarity, "Oh, that's just our drama queen being dramatic." What made it particularly insidious was how the nickname evolved to encompass any emotional response I had. If I cried when hurt, I was being dramatic. If I expressed frustration with schoolwork, I was putting on a performance. If I showed enthusiasm about anything, I was seeking attention in my characteristic, over-the-top way. The label became a lens through which every aspect of my personality was interpreted. My genuine medical episodes were dramatic. My emotional responses to being dismissed were dramatic. My attempts to explain what I was experiencing were dramatic. Even my successes were somehow connected to my need for attention and performance. By age 12, I had internalized this label so completely that I began to doubt my own experiences. When an episode would begin, I'd find myself wondering if I was somehow choosing it, if I was subconsciously creating these frightening moments for the attention they brought. The nickname had achieved its intended purpose. It diminished my medical reality while maintaining the family's comfortable narrative that I was simply a child with behavioral issues that could be managed through appropriate discipline and reduced attention. Drama queen. 2 words that would shape my relationship with my own body, my family, and my right to medical care for the next 7 years. The transformation from occasional episodes to a pervasive family problem began during 7th grade, when my seizures became more frequent and unpredictable. What had once been isolated incidents happening every few weeks suddenly escalated to multiple episodes per week, sometimes occurring at the most inconvenient moments imaginable. The first major incident happened during Caspian's state championship basketball game. Our entire extended family had driven 3 hours to watch him play, filling an entire row in the gymnasium with matching blue and gold t-shirts. My parents had been planning this moment for months, treating it as a showcase of their successful parenting and our family's athletic excellence. I felt the familiar warning signs during the second quarter, the rising sensation in my stomach, the way sounds became distant and hollow. I tried to ignore it, knowing how important this game was to everyone, but the episode hit with unusual intensity. I lost awareness completely, my body convulsing in ways that drew attention from spectators several rows away. When I came back to consciousness, paramedics were kneeling beside me in the gymnasium hallway. The game had been briefly paused, with hundreds of people craning their necks to see what was happening. My mother's face was flushed with a mixture of concern and mortification as she provided medical history to the EMTs. "Has this happened before?" the paramedic asked, checking my pulse and pupils. "She has episodes," my father interjected before my mother could respond. "We've had her evaluated. It's behavioral." The paramedic frowned, clearly unconvinced by this explanation for what he'd witnessed, but my parents' unified front was persuasive. They declined transport to the hospital, signed the necessary waivers, and we returned to the game as if nothing had happened. But everything had changed. For the rest of the evening, relatives whispered among themselves, shooting concerned glances in my direction. My grandmother Estelle kept asking if I was feeling all right, while my Uncle Donovan pulled my parents aside for hushed conversations about escalating attention-seeking behaviors and the need for firmer boundaries. The drive home was excruciating. Caspian's team had won, but his moment of triumph was overshadowed by what the family now referred to as Sage's scene. My brother sat in furious silence, earbuds in, staring out the window. My sister Izzy kept asking if I was okay, but even her questions felt loaded with the family's growing frustration. "This can't keep happening," my mother finally said as we pulled into our driveway. "Sage, you need to find better ways to manage your anxiety. This is affecting the entire family." The suggestion that I was somehow choosing the timing of my episodes became a recurring theme. When I had a seizure during Izzy's piano recital, the family concluded I was jealous of her artistic success. When an episode interrupted my father's important work call, it was obviously a bid for attention during his busy season. When I seized during a family barbecue with my parents' friends, it was clearly because I resented not being the center of conversation. The pattern became predictable and exhausting. Each episode was followed by a family analysis session where my motives were dissected and my behavior was pathologized. The seizures themselves were almost secondary to the emotional aftermath, the disappointment, the accusations, the reinforcement of my identity as the family member who couldn't be counted on to behave appropriately. School became another battlefield entirely. Miss Winifred Blackwell, the school nurse, documented every episode meticulously, noting details that my family consistently overlooked or dismissed. She observed the involuntary movements, the confusion that followed, the way I couldn't recall what had happened during the episodes. "These don't look like panic attacks," she told my parents during a conference that I wasn't allowed to attend. "Have you considered seeing a neurologist?" My parents' response was swift and defensive. "We've consulted with multiple medical professionals," my mother replied, which was technically true but misleading. "The consensus is that these are anxiety-related episodes that Sage needs to learn to manage." Miss Blackwell persisted, showing them her documentation, but my parents had already made up their minds. They requested that I be sent to the principal's office instead of the nurse's office when episodes occurred at school, treating them as disciplinary issues rather than medical emergencies. The school psychologist, Dr. Rachel Morton, became involved when my episodes began affecting my academic performance. I'd lose awareness during tests, miss important instructions during seizures, and struggle with post-episode confusion that could last for hours. Dr. Morton's approach was more nuanced than my family's, but ultimately just as dismissive of the medical reality. She conducted a series of assessments designed to uncover the psychological triggers for my conversion symptoms. When I couldn't identify specific traumas or family stressors that correlated with my episodes, she concluded that I was exhibiting somatic symptom disorder, essentially creating physical symptoms to express emotional distress I couldn't articulate. Teenagers often develop these patterns when they feel voiceless in their families, she explained to my parents. Sage may be using these episodes as a way to communicate needs that she doesn't know how to express directly. This explanation satisfied everyone except me. It positioned my seizures as a communication problem that could be solved through better emotional expression and family dynamics work. The fact that my episodes had no correlation with family stress, occurred during happy moments as often as difficult ones, and followed patterns that seemed completely disconnected from my emotional state was dismissed as evidence of how deeply subconscious this behavioral pattern had become. The medical establishment seemed determined to avoid considering neurological causes. Dr. Pemberton Hayes, our family physician, had referred me to specialists, but always with a framing that suggested psychological rather than medical issues. The referrals went to psychiatrists and therapists rather than neurologists or epilepsy specialists. Each professional I saw seemed to take their cues from my parents' presentation of the problem. When they described my episodes as attention-seeking behavior that had been ongoing for years, the mental health professionals would nod knowingly and begin exploring family dynamics, school stress, and adolescent development issues. The few times I tried to describe what I actually experienced during episodes, the physical sensations, the loss of control, the genuine confusion afterward, my descriptions were interpreted through the lens of psychological distress rather than medical symptoms. My detailed accounts of how the episodes felt were seen as evidence of how sophisticated my conversion symptoms had become, rather than important diagnostic information. By 8th grade, the dismissal had become so systematic and comprehensive that I began to doubt my own perceptions entirely. When an episode would begin, I'd find myself wondering if I was somehow causing it, if I was subconsciously seeking attention or trying to escape from difficult situations. The family's response had evolved from initial concern to weary frustration to active resentment. My episodes were no longer medical mysteries to be solved, but behavioral problems to be managed. I had become the family member who couldn't be trusted to maintain appropriate behavior during important events, whose unpredictable episodes created stress and embarrassment for everyone else. The transformation was complete. I was no longer a daughter with unexplained medical symptoms. I was drama queen, the family member whose performances disrupted normal life and required constant management and damage control. The moment that changed everything happened on a Tuesday in October during my sophomore year of high school. I remember the date precisely, October 15th, because it was the day I realized I might not survive my family's version of love. The episode began during second period chemistry, while Mrs. Patterson was explaining molecular structures. I felt the familiar warning signs, the rising sensation, the way the classroom sounds became muffled and distant. But this time was different. This time, the seizure was more intense than anything I'd experienced before. I lost consciousness completely, falling from my lab stool onto the hard linoleum floor. According to witnesses, my body convulsed for nearly 4 minutes while my classmates screamed for help. Mrs. Patterson cleared the classroom and called 911, convinced she was watching a medical emergency unfold. When the paramedics arrived, I was still in the postictal state, the confused, disoriented period that follows a severe seizure. I couldn't remember my name, couldn't recognize familiar faces, couldn't form coherent sentences. The EMTs immediately began treating it as a neurological emergency, checking my vitals, testing my responses, preparing to transport me to the hospital for immediate evaluation. That's when my parents arrived. My mother, Cordelia, swept into the classroom like she was managing a public relations crisis, which in her mind, she was. She took one look at me sitting on the floor, still confused and struggling to speak clearly, and immediately began damage control. I'm so sorry about this disruption, she told Mrs. Patterson, her voice carrying that familiar mixture of embarrassment and authority. Sage has been having these episodes for years. We're working with specialists to manage her anxiety disorder. The paramedic looked up from his assessment, confusion clear on his face. Ma'am, this wasn't a panic attack. Your daughter had a tonic-clonic seizure that lasted almost 4 minutes. She needs to be evaluated at the hospital immediately. My father Thaddeus stepped forward, his insurance adjuster instincts kicking into gear. We appreciate your concern, but we've been dealing with these episodes for a long time. Multiple doctors have confirmed their behavioral. We know how to handle this. Sir, with respect, what I witnessed was not behavioral, the paramedic insisted, his voice becoming more urgent. A 4-minute seizure can cause brain damage. She needs immediate medical attention. My father Thaddeus stepped forward, his insurance adjuster instincts kicking into gear. We appreciate your concern, but we've been dealing with these episodes for a long time. Multiple doctors have confirmed their behavioral. We know how to handle this. Sir, with respect, what I witnessed was not behavioral, the paramedic insisted, his voice becoming more urgent. A 4-minute seizure can cause brain damage. She needs immediate medical attention. My father Thaddeus stepped forward, his insurance adjuster instincts kicking into gear. We appreciate your concern, but we've been dealing with these episodes for a long time. Multiple doctors have confirmed their behavioral. We know how to handle this. Sir, with respect, what I witnessed was not behavioral, the paramedic insisted, his voice becoming more urgent. A 4-minute seizure can cause brain damage. She needs immediate medical attention. But my parents had already made their decision. They declined transport, signed the liability waivers, and prepared to take me home. I was still too confused to advocate for myself, too disoriented to understand what was happening, or why everyone seemed to be arguing about me. The drive home was conducted in tense silence. I sat in the back seat, slowly regaining my ability to form sentences, trying to piece together what had happened. My head was pounding, my body ached from the convulsions, and I felt exhausted in a way that seemed to reach into my bones. This was your worst performance yet, my father finally said as we pulled into our driveway, in front of your entire chemistry class, disrupting everyone's education. When are you going to learn that this behavior isn't acceptable? Something inside me shattered at that moment. Here I was, still recovering from what had clearly been a medical emergency, and my father was lecturing me about my performance. The disconnect between my physical reality and their interpretation of it had become so extreme that I felt like I was living in an alternate universe. That evening, as I lay in bed still exhausted and confused, I could hear my parents on the phone with my Uncle Donovan, discussing strategies for managing this escalation. Their voices carried clearly through the house's thin walls. It's getting worse, my mother was saying. The episodes are more dramatic, lasting longer. She's clearly learned that bigger performances get more attention. You need to consider residential treatment, Uncle Donovan replied, his psychologist voice calm and authoritative. Sometimes removal from the family environment is necessary to break these entrenched patterns. The words hit me like physical blows. Residential treatment. They were discussing sending me away, not for medical care, but for behavioral modification. They truly believed I was creating these terrifying episodes, these moments when I lost complete control of my body and mind, as some kind of elaborate attention-seeking performance. I lay there in the dark, replaying every seizure I'd ever had, every moment of confusion and fear, every instance where I'd begged them to believe that something was wrong with me. And I realized that no amount of evidence would ever convince them. No matter how severe my symptoms became, no matter how many outside observers expressed concern, my family had invested too much in their narrative to consider alternatives. That night, for the first time in my life, I seriously considered what it would mean to give up. The thought appeared quietly, almost gently. Maybe it would be easier to stop fighting, to stop trying to convince people who were determined not to see. The realization terrified me more than any seizure ever had. I was 17 years old, and I was contemplating surrender, not because my medical condition was untreatable, but because my family's denial of my medical condition was suffocating me. I spent hours that night researching residential treatment facilities online, trying to understand what my family was planning for me. The websites showed sterile dormitories, strict schedules, therapy sessions focused on behavior modification. These weren't medical facilities designed to treat seizure disorders. They were psychiatric institutions designed to break what staff considered manipulative behavioral patterns. The prospect of being sent away from everything familiar, of being placed in an environment where my seizures would be treated as psychiatric symptoms rather than neurological events, filled me with a desperation I'd never experienced before. But alongside the desperation came something else: clarity. I realized that I had two choices. I could continue participating in my family's version of my story, allowing them to define my medical reality and determine my treatment, which would likely result in years of inappropriate psychiatric intervention. Or I could find a way to take control of my own narrative, to seek the medical evaluation I needed regardless of whether my family supported it. The decision crystallized slowly, like frost forming on a window. I couldn't keep waiting for my family to see what was happening to me. I couldn't keep hoping that the next episode would finally convince them, because their investment and denial had become stronger than any evidence I could provide. I needed to find a way to get proper medical evaluation on my own terms, without my parents' interpretation filtering every interaction with healthcare providers. I needed to become my own advocate, even if it meant going against everything my family believed about me. The breaking point wasn't just the seizure itself. It was the moment I realized that my family's love, however genuine, was conditional on my accepting their version of my reality. And their version of my reality was literally killing me.
That night, lying in my bed with a post-seizure headache still pounding in my skull, I made a promise to myself. I would find out what was really wrong with me, with or without their support. The drama queen was about to go off script. The first step toward reclaiming my medical reality began with something as simple as keeping a seizure diary. The morning after my parents discussed residential treatment, I found an old composition notebook buried in my desk drawer and started documenting everything they had trained me to dismiss. Date, time, duration, what I was doing when it started, what I remembered afterward. The physical sensations I experienced, the aura that preceded each episode, the way my vision changed, the specific movements my body made without my permission. All the details my family had taught me were either exaggerated or fabricated. Writing it down felt revolutionary. For years, my episodes had been filtered through other people's interpretations before they were considered real. My parents would describe them to doctors as behavioral outbursts. Teachers would report them as disruptive classroom incidents. Even I had learned to minimize them, to question my own memories, to doubt the severity of what I experienced. But the new book didn't judge or interpret. It just recorded facts. And the facts, laid out in my careful handwriting day after day, painted a picture that was impossible to dismiss as attention-seeking behavior. October 16th, 2:47 p.m., during study hall. Duration approximately 90 seconds. Started with metallic taste and feeling of rising panic that I couldn't control. Lost awareness. Came back to Miss Rodriguez asking if I was okay. Confused for about 10 minutes afterward. October 18th, 7:23 a.m., while getting ready for school. Duration about 2 minutes. Dad said I was putting on a show to avoid the history test, but I had studied for that test. Why would I want to avoid it? October 22, 11:15 p.m., lying in bed reading. No one around to perform for, no stressful situation, just reading a book I enjoyed. Episode lasted nearly 3 minutes. Woke up on the floor next to my bed with a bitten tongue. That last entry was particularly important. I had seized alone, with no audience, while doing something I loved. The idea that this was performed behavior became harder to maintain when there was literally no one to perform for. My friend Phoenix Rivera became my first ally in this quiet rebellion. Phoenix was one of those rare teenagers who possessed both genuine empathy and complete fearlessness when it came to challenging authority. When I finally worked up the courage to tell her what my family believed about my episodes, her response was immediate and fierce.
That's insane, she said, using the blunt honesty that made her both wonderful and occasionally problematic as a friend. I've seen you have seizures, Sage. You're not faking anything. Your parents are just scared and taking it out on you. Phoenix's validation was oxygen to my suffocating sense of reality. Here was someone who had witnessed my episodes without the filter of family dynamics or psychological theories. Her perspective was clean, uncomplicated. She saw medical symptoms and called them medical symptoms. You need to see a real doctor, she continued, pulling out her phone. Not some family doctor who's already decided what's wrong with you, a neurologist. The word hung between us like a promise. Neurologist. A specialist who would look at my brain instead of my behavior, who would consider medical causes instead of psychological ones. But accessing a neurologist as a 17-year-old without parental support presented obvious challenges. Our insurance required referrals. Appointments needed parental consent. Even if I could somehow see a specialist, my parents would inevitably become involved, bringing their predetermined narrative with them. My mom might help, Phoenix offered. Phoenix's mother, Dr. Carmen Rivera, was a family physician at a different practice across town. She's always complaining about how dismissive doctors can be toward teenage girls. Maybe she'd be willing to see you informally, just to give you some direction. The suggestion terrified me. Going behind my parents' backs felt like crossing a line I'd never imagined approaching. But the alternative, accepting their version of my reality, felt like a slower form of suicide. 2 weeks later, I found myself in Dr. Rivera's office after school, my seizure diary clutched in sweaty palms. Phoenix had arranged it as a casual consultation, something that wouldn't require insurance or formal documentation, just a concerned mother helping a teenager get a second opinion. Dr. Rivera was nothing like Dr. Pemberton Hayes. She was younger, more direct, and had the kind of professional confidence that didn't require dismissing patients to maintain authority. She listened to my entire history without interruption, occasionally asking specific questions about symptoms my family had taught me to minimize. "Tell me about the aura," she said, referring to the warning sensations that preceded my episodes. "What exactly do you experience?" I described the metallic taste, the rising panic, the way sounds became muffled and distant, the visual changes, how light seemed to dim or brighten unpredictably, the way my stomach would drop, like going down a steep hill too fast. Dr. Rivera nodded, taking notes. "And during the episodes themselves, what do witnesses report?" I consulted my diary, reading descriptions that Phoenix and other classmates had provided. The involuntary movements, the way my eyes would track strangely, the confusion that followed. "How long does the post-ictal period last?" she asked, using medical terminology I had to ask her to explain. The post-ictal period, she told me, was the recovery time after a seizure, when the brain is essentially rebooting itself. "Usually 10 to 20 minutes, I said, flipping through pages of documented episodes. Sometimes longer if it was a bad one. Dr. Rivera was quiet for a long moment, reviewing my notes. When she finally looked up, her expression was serious but not unkind. "Sage, I'm not a neurologist, so I can't diagnose you definitively, but what you're describing sounds very much like temporal lobe epilepsy. The aura, the automatisms, the post-ictal confusion, these are classic presentations." The words hit me like a physical force. Temporal lobe epilepsy, an actual medical condition with a name, diagnostic criteria, treatments, not a behavioral disorder or attention-seeking pattern, a neurological condition that could be identified, understood, managed. "But my parents' doctor said..." "Your parents' doctor was looking for psychological causes instead of medical ones," Dr. Rivera interrupted gently. "It's unfortunately common, especially with teenage girls. When symptoms don't fit obvious patterns, there's a tendency to assume they must be behavioral." She leaned forward, her expression becoming more intense. "Sage, if this is epilepsy, and I suspect it is, you need proper medical evaluation. These episodes can become more frequent and more severe without appropriate treatment. Some forms of temporal lobe epilepsy can even be life-threatening if left untreated." The validation was overwhelming. After years of being told my symptoms were fabricated, here was a medical professional taking them seriously, treating them as legitimate health concerns that required attention rather than dismissal. "What do I do?" I asked, my voice smaller than I intended. "You need to see a neurologist," she said, echoing Phoenix's earlier advice. "I can give you a referral, but you'll need parental consent for the appointment." We both knew that parental consent was the insurmountable obstacle. My parents would never agree to neurological evaluation based on my self-reported symptoms and an informal consultation they hadn't authorized. But Dr. Rivera wasn't finished. "There is another option," she said carefully. "Emergency departments can't turn away patients experiencing active medical symptoms. If you have another episode, a significant one, and you go to the ER immediately afterward, they'll be required to evaluate you properly." She was suggesting that I advocate for myself during medical emergencies, that I refuse to let my parents control the narrative when I was actively symptomatic. "Just remember," she added, handing me her business card, "you have the right to speak for yourself medically. You're almost 18. Your voice matters, even if your family doesn't want to hear it." Walking out of that office, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: hope grounded in medical reality rather than wishful thinking. For the first time, a healthcare professional had listened to my symptoms and responded with appropriate concern, rather than dismissive theories about teenage psychology. The drama queen was learning to trust her own voice. Armed with Dr. Rivera's validation and her business card tucked safely in my wallet, I entered what would become the most challenging 6 months of my life. The period between knowing something was medically wrong with me and actually getting proper treatment stretched like a desert, vast, difficult, and seemingly endless. My seizure diary became my Bible during this time. Every episode was meticulously documented, not just for my own understanding, but as evidence for the day when I could finally present my case to a neurologist. The notebook filled page after page with entries that painted an increasingly urgent picture. November 3, 6:45 a.m., in shower. Duration 3 minutes. Came to on bathroom floor with hot water still running. Bruised shoulder from fall. Mom said I must have slipped. Didn't mention the confusion or the fact that I couldn't remember how I got there. November 8, 4:30 p.m., driving home from school. Had to pull over when I felt aura starting. Episode lasted about 2 minutes. Called Phoenix to pick me up. Couldn't drive for rest of day due to post-ictal confusion. Parents said I was being overly dramatic about a little dizzy spell. That entry terrified me more than any before it. The realization that I could have a seizure while driving, potentially hurting myself or others, made the urgency of proper medical care feel life or death. But when I tried to discuss this with my parents, they dismissed it as another attention-seeking exaggeration. "Sage, you're being ridiculous," my mother said when I mentioned my fear of driving during episodes. "You're a perfectly safe driver. Stop creating problems where none exist." But the problems were multiplying, whether my family acknowledged them or not. My academic performance began suffering as episodes interrupted tests and class presentations. Teachers who had once been sympathetic started showing frustration with my disruptions. Even Miss Winifred Blackwell, the school nurse who had advocated for me, seemed worn down by the ongoing situation. "Have you considered that stress might be making your episodes worse?" she asked during one of my frequent visits to her office. "Maybe if you could find better ways to manage anxiety." The suggestion that I was somehow causing my own seizures through poor stress management felt like a betrayal from someone who had previously understood. But I was beginning to realize that even well-meaning adults were more comfortable with psychological explanations than neurological ones. Phoenix remained my lifeline during this period, offering both practical support and emotional validation. She learned to recognize my pre-seizure behavior, positioning herself to help when episodes occurred in public spaces. More importantly, she never questioned the medical reality of what I was experiencing. Your parents are idiots, she said after a particularly bad episode at school that my father dismissed as performance art. When you turn 18, you can see any doctor you want. They can't stop you then. 18 felt simultaneously close and impossibly far away. My birthday was still 4 months out, and the seizures were becoming more frequent and more severe. I was having episodes multiple times per week now, sometimes daily. The post-ictal confusion was lasting longer, sometimes extending for hours after the initial seizure. During this period, I became expert at hiding the severity of my symptoms from my family. If I had an episode at school, I'd claim it was just feeling dizzy. If I seized at home, I'd retreat to my room immediately afterward, emerging only when I could appear relatively normal. This deception was exhausting, but it felt necessary to avoid the family crisis meetings that inevitably followed public episodes. My brother Caspian, now in his final year of pre-med, occasionally showed moments of concern that surprised me. During one particularly severe episode that I couldn't completely hide, he found me in the kitchen afterward, still disoriented and struggling to remember what I'd been doing before the seizure. "Sage," he said quietly, looking around to make sure our parents weren't nearby, "this isn't normal. What you just experienced, that's not anxiety or attention-seeking. Have you ever seen a neurologist?" For a moment, I thought he might become an ally. But when I explained that our parents refused to consider neurological evaluation, he retreated into familiar family dynamics. "They're just worried about you," he said, his medical school training apparently not extending to advocating against parental authority. "Maybe try to work with the therapists they've found. Sometimes psychological treatment can help physical symptoms too." Even my sister Izzy, who had always been the most sympathetic family member, seemed to be absorbing the family narrative that my episodes were somehow under my control. She started avoiding me when I showed signs of pre-seizure aura, as if my condition might be contagious or deliberately triggered. The isolation was crushing. At 17, I felt like I was fighting a war on multiple fronts, against my medical condition, against my family's denial, against a healthcare system that seemed designed to dismiss teenage girl symptoms, against my own growing self-doubt. The turning point came during a particularly severe episode in December. I was Christmas shopping at the mall with Phoenix when the aura hit stronger than ever before. The metallic taste in my mouth was overwhelming, and the visual distortions were more intense than I'd ever experienced. "We need to get you somewhere safe," Phoenix said, recognizing the warning signs immediately. She guided me to a quiet corner near the food court and called her mother. The seizure lasted over 5 minutes, longer than any I'd previously experienced. When I finally regained awareness, paramedics were kneeling beside me and a crowd had gathered. Phoenix had called 911 when the episode extended beyond what she'd ever witnessed before. This time, she didn't let my parents control the narrative. "This isn't anxiety," she told the paramedics firmly, while my mother tried to explain about my behavioral patterns. "I've been documenting these episodes for months. She has classic temporal lobe seizure symptoms, aura, automatisms, post-ictal confusion. She needs to see a neurologist." The paramedic looked between Phoenix and my parents, clearly uncertain about the conflicting information. "Has she been evaluated by a specialist?" he asked. "Her family physician says the episodes are psychological," my father interjected. "But no neurologist has ever examined her," Phoenix added pointedly. Something shifted in the paramedic's expression. He began asking me direct questions about my symptoms, speaking to me rather than to my parents. When I described the aura, the involuntary movements, the confusion that followed episodes, he nodded with recognition. "I'm recommending transport for evaluation," he said. "These symptoms warrant neurological assessment." My parents protested, but I found my voice. "I want to go to the hospital," I said, my words still slightly slurred from the post-ictal state, but clear enough to understand. "I want to know what's wrong with me." The ride to the emergency department felt like crossing a bridge I'd been approaching for months. Finally, I would have my symptoms evaluated by medical professionals who didn't already have predetermined conclusions about my condition. Finally, someone might listen to what my body had been trying to tell everyone for years. As the ambulance pulled away from the mall, I squeezed Phoenix's hand and whispered the words that had taken me months to find the courage to say, "I'm going to get answers, whether they want me to or not." The emergency department at Presbyterian Hospital became the first place where my voice carried more weight than my parents' preconceptions. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, the attending physician, was a woman in her 40s with the kind of direct competence that inspired immediate confidence. Unlike every other medical professional I'd encountered, she spoke directly to me from the moment she entered the examination room. "Sage, I understand you had a seizure at the mall," she said, pulling up a chair to sit at my eye level. "Can you tell me what you experienced, starting from when you first felt something was different?" The question was revolutionary in its simplicity. No one had ever asked me to describe my own symptoms without filtering them through my parents' interpretation first. I pulled out my seizure diary, which had become so comprehensive that even the skeptical triage nurse had been impressed. "The aura started about 2 minutes before the actual seizure," I began, reading from my careful documentation. "Metallic taste, rising sensation in my stomach, visual changes where everything seemed too bright and too dim at the same time." Dr. Walsh nodded, taking notes. "And during the episode itself?" "I lose consciousness completely. My friend Phoenix says I have repetitive hand movements, my eyes track strangely, and I don't respond to verbal commands. Usually lasts 2 to 4 minutes, but today was over 5. "The post-ictal period?" she asked, using the medical terminology that Dr. Rivera had taught me. "Confusion, difficulty with word finding, exhaustion. Today it lasted about 30 minutes before I felt cognitively clear again." My parents, who had been relegated to chairs along the wall, exchanged glances. They weren't accustomed to medical professionals treating me as the primary source of information about my own condition. "Dr. Walsh," my mother interjected, "we've been dealing with these episodes for years. Multiple doctors have confirmed they're anxiety-related. Sage tends to embellish the symptoms." Dr. Walsh turned to face my parents, her expression neutral but firm. "I appreciate your perspective, but what I'm hearing describes classic temporal lobe seizure activity. Has Sage ever been evaluated by a neurologist?" "We've seen plenty of specialists," my father said defensively. "Neurologists specifically," Dr. Walsh clarified. The silence that followed was answer enough. Dr. Walsh turned back to me. "Sage, I'm going to order an EEG and some blood work. We'll also do a CT scan to rule out any structural abnormalities. But based on what you're describing, I suspect you're dealing with temporal lobe epilepsy, not anxiety disorder." The validation was overwhelming. Here was a medical professional with actual expertise in emergency medicine looking at my symptoms and reaching the same conclusion that Dr. Rivera had suggested months earlier. "More importantly," Dr. Walsh continued, "I'm referring you to Dr. Amara Okafor, one of our neurologists. She specializes in epilepsy and has particular expertise with cases that have been misdiagnosed as psychological disorders." My parents protested, but Dr. Walsh was unswayed. "This patient is almost 18 and is describing symptoms that could be life-threatening if left untreated. Temporal lobe epilepsy can progress to more dangerous seizure types without proper medication." The tests that followed over the next 4 hours painted a clear picture. The EEG showed abnormal electrical activity in my left temporal lobe. The blood work ruled out metabolic causes. The CT scan was normal, which Dr. Walsh explained was actually typical for temporal lobe epilepsy. "So it's definitely epilepsy?" I asked, still barely able to believe that someone was finally taking my symptoms seriously. "I can't make that official diagnosis. That's Dr. Okafor's expertise," Dr. Walsh replied. "But yes, everything we're seeing is consistent with temporal lobe epilepsy. You've been having real seizures, not anxiety attacks." The words hit me like a physical force. Real seizures. After years of being told my episodes were behavioral, psychological, attention-seeking, here was medical proof that my brain was misfiring in documented, measurable ways. My parents sat in stunned silence as Dr. Walsh explained what temporal lobe epilepsy was, how it could be managed with medication, and why early treatment was crucial. Their entire framework for understanding my condition was crumbling in real time. But Dr. Hayes said, my mother began weakly. Dr. Hayes is a family physician, not a neurologist, Dr. Walsh replied without judgment. This kind of misdiagnosis is unfortunately common, especially in teenage girls, whose symptoms are often attributed to emotional or behavioral causes. Phoenix squeezed my hand as the discharge nurse provided information about seizure safety, medication management, and what to expect from neurological care. For the first time in years, I was receiving medical information meant to help me manage a real condition rather than psychological techniques meant to help me control imaginary symptoms. Dr. O'Coffer's office called the next morning to schedule an appointment. Her receptionist, Marlo Thompson, was warm and efficient, explaining that Dr. O'Coffer had reviewed my emergency department records and wanted to see me as soon as possible. She's particularly interested in cases like yours, Marlo explained, young women whose seizures have been misdiagnosed as behavioral disorders. She says it's unfortunately more common than people realize. The appointment was scheduled for the following week. In the meantime, Dr. Walsh had prescribed a low-dose anti-seizure medication to help prevent episodes while we waited for more comprehensive neurological evaluation. That first dose felt like swallowing validation in pill form. Here was medication specifically designed to treat seizures, proof that what I'd been experiencing was a legitimate neurological condition that required medical intervention, not therapy or behavioral modification. The change in family dynamics was immediate and uncomfortable. My parents, faced with undeniable medical evidence that their interpretation of my condition had been wrong, struggled to adjust their understanding. They weren't malicious people, but they had invested years in a narrative that positioned my episodes as behavioral problems they could solve through appropriate parenting strategies. We were just trying to help you, my mother said during a tense family conversation the night after my emergency department visit. All the doctors we consulted said it was anxiety. One doctor, I corrected, my new sense of medical advocacy making me braver than I'd ever been. Dr. Hayes, and he never referred me to specialists who might have seen what Dr. Walsh saw in 4 hours. Caspian, whose pre-med training was finally being applied constructively, looked up temporal lobe epilepsy on his laptop. This says early diagnosis and treatment are crucial, he reported, his voice carrying a note of concern that had been absent during years of dismissing my episodes. Some forms can be life-threatening if untreated. The realization that my condition could have been dangerous, that their dismissal could have had serious medical consequences, seemed to shake my parents more than anything else. They had thought they were protecting me from unnecessary medical intervention. Instead, they had prevented me from receiving necessary neurological care. My grandmother Estelle called that evening, having heard about the emergency department visit from my parents. Her response was characteristically direct. I always knew those episodes weren't behavioral, she said. I'm just sorry it took this long for someone to listen to you. Her validation meant more than she could know. Here was someone who had witnessed my seizures for years, who had never been convinced by the psychological explanations, who had been quietly in my corner even when she couldn't openly challenge the family narrative. As I prepared for my appointment with Dr. Okafor, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years, hope based on medical reality rather than wishful thinking. I had allies now, Dr. Walsh, Phoenix, Dr. Rivera, and even my grandmother Estelle. More importantly, I had documentation, test results, and a referral to a specialist who understood that teenage girls could have real neurological conditions that deserved serious medical attention. Dr. Amara O'Coffer's office was nothing like the sterile, intimidating medical spaces I'd grown accustomed to over the years. The walls were lined with books about neurology and epilepsy, interspersed with artwork that felt warm and welcoming. Plants thrived on her windowsills, and soft lighting made the space feel more like a study than a clinical examination room. Dr. O'Coffer herself was a striking woman in her early 50s, with confident posture and eyes that seemed to see everything. When she entered the room, she greeted me first, not my parents, not the medical assistant, but me directly. "Sage," she said, extending her hand for a firm handshake. "I've read your emergency department records and I'm very interested in your case. Before we begin, I want you to know that in my practice, the patient is the primary source of medical information. You know your body better than anyone else in this room." The statement was revolutionary. After years of having my symptoms interpreted, dismissed, and reframed by others, here was a specialist explicitly stating that my experience mattered most. I understand you've been having seizure-like episodes for nearly 10 years, she continued, settling into her chair, and that they've been attributed to psychological causes. I want to hear your story, starting from the very beginning, without any interpretation or editing from well-meaning family members. My parents shifted uncomfortably in their seats, but Dr. Okaffer's attention remained focused entirely on me. I pulled out my seizure diary, now thick with months of careful documentation. The first episode I remember clearly was when I was 8, I began, feeling more confident than I had in any medical setting before. It was during a math lesson. I felt this rising sensation in my stomach, like going down a steep hill too fast. For the next 40 minutes, I walked Dr. Okafor through my complete history. She asked detailed questions about the aura symptoms, the automatisms I experienced during seizures, the post-ictal confusion that followed. She took extensive notes, occasionally asking for clarification, but never once suggesting that my descriptions might be exaggerated or fabricated. When I finished, she reviewed her notes silently for several minutes before speaking. Sage, what you're describing is textbook temporal lobe epilepsy with complex partial seizures, she said, her voice carrying absolute certainty. The aura, the automatisms, the post-ictal confusion, every detail you've provided is consistent with focal seizures originating in your left temporal lobe. The words hung in the air like a benediction. Temporal lobe epilepsy. Complex partial seizures, medical terms that gave my experiences names, categories, legitimacy. But Dr. Hayes said, my mother began. Dr. Okafor held up a hand politely but firmly. Dr. Hayes is not a neurologist. What Sage has been experiencing are not anxiety attacks, not behavioral episodes, not conversion symptoms. They are seizures caused by abnormal electrical activity in her brain. She turned to a model of the brain on her desk, pointing to the temporal lobe region. This area controls memory, emotion, and sensory processing. When seizures originate here, they often don't look like the generalized tonic-clonic seizures most people associate with epilepsy. Instead, they can appear subtle, even behavioral, which leads to frequent misdiagnoses. Especially in young women, she continued, her tone becoming more pointed. There's an unfortunate tendency in medicine to attribute unexplained symptoms in teenage girls to psychological causes rather than investigating neurological possibilities. It's a form of medical gaslighting that I see far too often. My father leaned forward, his insurance adjuster instincts engaging. What kind of tests can prove this definitively? We already have proof, Dr. Okafor replied, consulting the emergency department records. The EEG from Presbyterian Hospital clearly shows elliptiform activity in the left temporal region, but I'm going to order additional testing to fully characterize Sage's epilepsy and develop an optimal treatment plan. She explained the process: a prolonged EEG monitoring session to capture seizures as they occurred, an MRI to look for any structural abnormalities, and blood work to establish baseline levels before starting medication. The good news is that temporal lobe epilepsy is highly treatable, she continued. With the right anti-seizure medication, most patients achieve excellent seizure control. Some become completely seizure-free. The possibility of being seizure-free felt almost too incredible to believe. After nearly a decade of unpredictable episodes disrupting every aspect of my life, the idea that medication could prevent them entirely seemed miraculous. Why wasn't this diagnosed earlier? My mother asked, her voice small and strained. Dr. Okafor's expression softened slightly. Unfortunately, this type of misdiagnosis is common. Temporal lobe seizures can be subtle and easy to misinterpret, especially when healthcare providers aren't specifically looking for neurological causes. The medical community has historically been too quick to assume psychological causes for unexplained symptoms in young women. She turned back to me. Sage, I want you to understand that everything you've experienced has been real. Your brain has been having seizures. The confusion, the memory issues, the fear, all of it was caused by abnormal electrical activity, not anxiety or attention-seeking behavior. The validation was overwhelming. For years, I had internalized the message that my symptoms were somehow my fault, that I was creating them subconsciously or failing to manage my emotions appropriately. Now, a leading neurologist was telling me that my brain had been malfunctioning in measurable, documented ways. "How long has she been having seizures?" Dr. Okafor asked, reviewing my timeline. "Nearly 10 years," I said. 10 years of untreated epilepsy," she murmured, making notes. "We need to start treatment immediately. Prolonged untreated temporal lobe epilepsy can lead to cognitive changes and increased risk of more dangerous seizure types." The implications of this statement were staggering. Not only had my family's dismissal prevented me from receiving appropriate care, but their delay in seeking neurological evaluation had potentially put me at risk for long-term complications. "The important thing is that we're treating it now," Dr. Okafor continued, seeming to sense the emotional weight settling over the room. "I'm starting you on lamotrigine, an anti-seizure medication that's particularly effective for temporal lobe epilepsy and generally well tolerated by young women." She spent the next 20 minutes explaining the medication, its side effects, and what to expect as we adjusted the dosage. For the first time in my life, I was receiving medical information about managing epilepsy rather than psychological techniques for controlling anxiety. As the appointment concluded, Dr. Okafor handed me several educational pamphlets about epilepsy and a card for a local epilepsy support group. "Sage, you're going to do very well," she said, shaking my hand again. "You're articulate about your symptoms, you've documented them carefully, and you advocated for yourself when the adults around you weren't listening. Those are exactly the qualities that lead to successful epilepsy management." Walking out of that office, I felt fundamentally changed. The girl who had been called drama queen for years now had a medical diagnosis that explained everything. The episodes that had been dismissed as behavioral were actually seizures that could be treated with medication. For the first time in nearly a decade, I wasn't broken or attention-seeking or psychologically disturbed. I was a person with temporal lobe epilepsy, and that was something that could be managed. The car ride home from Dr. Okafor's office was conducted in the kind of silence that feels like pressure building in your ears. My parents sat in the front seats, processing the complete demolition of their understanding of my medical condition. I sat in the back, clutching the epilepsy education materials and prescription for lamotrigine, feeling like I was holding evidence of my vindication. My father was the first to speak as we pulled into our driveway. 10 years, he said, his voice hollow with something I'd never heard from him before, uncertainty. She said 10 years of untreated epilepsy? My mother remained silent, but I could see her hands trembling slightly as she unbuckled her seatbelt. The woman who had managed every family crisis with competent authority was clearly struggling to process that she had been fundamentally wrong about her daughter's medical condition. Inside the house, my parents retreated to their bedroom for what I could only assume was an urgent strategy session. Their voices carried through the thin walls, but the words were muffled. I could hear the tone, though. My father's confusion, my mother's defensive anger, both of them grappling with a reality that didn't match the narrative they'd constructed over nearly a decade. Caspian arrived home from university that evening, having been summoned by a tense phone call from our mother. He found me in the kitchen, reading through the epilepsy information pamphlets Dr. Okafor had provided. "So it's really epilepsy?" he asked, his pre-med training finally being applied to a situation where it was relevant and helpful. "Temporal lobe epilepsy with complex partial seizures," I said, using the precise medical terminology that Dr. Okafor had taught me. Everything I've been experiencing for the past 10 years, the aura, the automatisms, the post-ictal confusion, it's all classic seizure activity. Caspian sat down across from me, reviewing the medical literature I'd spread across the table. "This says early diagnosis and treatment are crucial for preventing cognitive complications," he read aloud. "Some forms can progress to more dangerous seizure types if left untreated." The implications hung between us. As the future doctor in the family, he understood better than our parents what 10 years of undiagnosed epilepsy might mean for long-term neurological health. "I'm sorry," he said, quietly, words I'd never expected to hear from my golden child brother. "I should have known this wasn't behavioral. I should have pushed for you to see specialists." His apology meant more than I could express. Here was someone who had participated in dismissing my symptoms, who had used the drama queen nickname, acknowledging that the medical evidence proved him wrong. My sister Izzy was harder to read when she returned from her theater rehearsal. At 16, she had absorbed years of family messaging about my episodes being attention-seeking behavior. Now she was being asked to completely reframe her understanding of her sister's condition. Does this mean all those times I got annoyed at you for having episodes during my performances? She began, then trailed off, seeming to realize the implications of what she was saying. You weren't having tantrums, she continued, her artistic sensitivity making her more emotionally aware than the rest of the family. You were having seizures, and we all just told you to stop. The family meeting that evening was unlike anything we'd ever experienced. My parents, clearly rattled by Dr. Okafor's diagnosis, attempted to maintain some semblance of parental authority while grappling with the reality that they had been medically wrong about their daughter for nearly a decade. We need to understand what this means going forward, my father said, his insurance adjuster instincts trying to impose order on the chaos of his revised understanding. What treatments are available, what the prognosis is, how we manage this as a family. We've been managing it wrong for 10 years, my mother said, her voice carrying a sharp edge that suggested anger at herself, at the medical system, at the situation in general. How were we supposed to know? Dr. Hayes assured us it was anxiety-related. Dr. Hayes isn't a neurologist, I said, finding courage I'd never possessed before. And none of you ever insisted on seeing a specialist when the psychological treatments weren't working. The statement landed like a challenge. For the first time in my life, I was directly confronting my family's medical decision-making, armed with actual expertise from a specialist who had validated my experiences. Sage, we were doing what we thought was best, my father said, but his usual authority was missing. Based on the medical advice we received. From one doctor, I corrected, one family physician who never referred me to specialists. And when the school nurse suggested seeing a neurologist, you shut it down. My mother's face flushed with defensive anger. We were protecting you from unnecessary medical procedures. We were trying to help you learn to manage your anxiety. I wasn't anxious, I said, my voice steady despite the emotional weight of the conversation. I was having seizures for 10 years, and instead of getting medical treatment, I got lectured about attention-seeking behavior. The room fell silent. The magnitude of their misunderstanding and its potential consequences was finally beginning to register. Uncle Donovan arrived later that evening, having been called in as the family's psychology expert. But his usual confident pronouncements about behavioral disorders seemed hollow in the face of Dr. Okafor's neurological diagnosis. Complex partial seizures can sometimes mimic psychological symptoms, he admitted, his professional pride clearly wounded by having been so thoroughly wrong. The distinction can be subtle. Not that subtle, I said, emboldened by months of careful documentation and validation from actual specialists. I documented every episode. The patterns were consistent with seizures, not anxiety attacks. My grandmother Estelle, who arrived shortly after Uncle Donovan, had a different reaction entirely. She sat beside me on the couch, took my hand, and said simply, I always knew those episodes weren't behavioral. I'm just sorry it took this long for someone to listen to you. Her straightforward acknowledgement of the medical reality, without defensiveness or excuses, highlighted how different her response was from the rest of the family. She had witnessed the same episodes everyone else had seen, but she had never bought into the psychological explanations. What happens now? Izzy asked, the first person to focus on moving forward rather than relitigating the past. Now I take anti-seizure medication and hopefully become seizure-free, I said, holding up the prescription for lamotrigine. Dr. Okafor says most people with temporal lobe epilepsy achieve excellent seizure control with proper treatment. The family looked at me, really looked at me, perhaps for the first time in years. Not as the drama queen whose episodes disrupted family events, but as their daughter and sister who had been suffering from a serious medical condition that they had completely misunderstood. The apologies, when they finally came, were complicated and inadequate. How do you apologize for 10 years of medical neglect? How do you acknowledge that your dismissal of someone's symptoms potentially put them at risk for serious neurological complications? We love you, Sage, my mother said finally, her voice carrying genuine remorse. We were trying to help, but we got it wrong, completely wrong. It wasn't enough. No apology could be, but it was acknowledgement. The family narrative that had defined me for nearly a decade was finally crumbling, replaced by medical reality and the uncomfortable recognition that love wasn't always enough if it wasn't accompanied by listening. 3 weeks after starting the lamotrigine, I experienced something I hadn't felt in nearly a decade: consistent freedom from seizures. Not just a few good days, but actual sustained periods without episodes. The medication was working, providing the first concrete proof that my condition had always been neurological, not psychological. The apologies, when they finally came, were complicated and inadequate. How do you apologize for 10 years of medical neglect? How do you acknowledge that your dismissal of someone's symptoms potentially put them at risk for serious neurological complications? We love you, Sage, my mother said finally, her voice carrying genuine remorse. We were trying to help, but we got it wrong, completely wrong. It wasn't enough, no apology could be, but it was acknowledgement. The family narrative that had defined me for nearly a decade was finally crumbling, replaced by medical reality and the uncomfortable recognition that love wasn't always enough if it wasn't accompanied by listening. 3 weeks after starting the lamotrigine, I experienced something I hadn't felt in nearly a decade: consistent freedom from seizures. Not just a few good days, but actual sustained periods without episodes. The medication was working, providing the first concrete proof that my condition had always been neurological, not psychological. This improvement gave me something I'd never possessed before: the confidence to directly confront the damage that years of dismissal had caused. The moment came during what should have been a celebration. My parents had planned a family dinner to acknowledge the progress I was making with my epilepsy treatment. But their framing of the situation, as if this were a recent development rather than a decade-long medical failure, finally pushed me beyond my tolerance for diplomatic silence. "We're just so relieved that you're finally getting the help you need," my mother said as she served dinner, her voice carrying the same tone she might use to discuss my recovery from a brief illness, rather than the management of a chronic condition I'd been denied treatment for since childhood. "Finally," I repeated, setting down my fork. "Mom, I needed this help 10 years ago. I needed it when I had my first seizure during math class. I needed it when I collapsed at Caspian's basketball game. I needed it when I begged you to take me to a specialist." My parents exchanged glances, clearly uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. They had hoped that successful treatment would allow us to move forward without extensively examining the past. "Sage, we've apologized," my father said, his insurance adjuster voice emerging as he tried to contain the discussion. "We made mistakes based on the medical advice we received, but dwelling on the past isn't productive." Dwelling on the past? I stood up from the table, months of accumulated anger finally finding expression. "Dad, I spent a decade thinking I was broken. I internalized every dismissal, every time you called my seizures performances, every lecture about attention-seeking behavior. Do you understand what that did to me psychologically? We were trying to help you develop better coping strategies," my mother interjected, but her voice lacked conviction. "I didn't need coping strategies," I said, my voice rising despite my efforts to stay calm. "I needed anti-seizure medication. I needed a neurologist. I needed parents who would listen when I said something was wrong with my body instead of immediately assuming I was lying or exaggerating." Caspian, who had been silently observing the confrontation, finally spoke up. "Sage has a point. We all participated in dismissing her symptoms. Even I did, and I'm supposed to be training to become a doctor." "Don't you dare lecture us about parenting," my mother snapped, her composure finally cracking. "We did everything we could with the information we had. We consulted doctors, we tried therapy, we researched behavioral interventions. We were not neglectful parents. You were medically neglectful, I said, the words landing like physical blows. You prevented me from receiving appropriate medical care for 10 years because you were more comfortable with psychological explanations than neurological ones. The room fell silent. I had never spoken to my parent with such directness about their failures, and they clearly didn't know how to respond. Furthermore, I continued, emboldened by their silence, you didn't just dismiss my symptoms, you actively discouraged others from taking them seriously. When the school nurse suggested neurological evaluation, you shut it down. When paramedics wanted to transport me to the hospital, you signed waivers against medical advice. You didn't just fail to help me, you actively prevented me from getting help. That's enough, my father said, his authority voice emerging. We made decisions based on professional medical advice. Dr. Hayes assured us. Dr. Hayes is a family physician, I interrupted. He's not qualified to diagnose neurological conditions. But you never sought out specialists because you were invested in believing that my episodes were behavioral problems you could solve through better parenting. My mother began crying, but I felt no sympathy. These were the same tears she'd shed during my behavioral episodes, the same emotional manipulation that had always diverted attention from my actual symptoms. I could have died, I said, my voice now steady and cold. Dr. O'Coffer told us that untreated temporal lobe epilepsy can progress to life-threatening seizure types. Your dismissal didn't just cause me psychological trauma, it put me at medical risk for an entire decade. We love you, my mother whispered through her tears. Love isn't enough, I replied. Love without listening, without believing, without advocating for your child's medical needs, that's not protective love, that's harmful love, and I won't pretend otherwise just to make you feel better about your failures. I left the dinner table and walked to my room, leaving my family to grapple with the unvarnished reality of what their decade of medical dismissal had cost me. For the first time in my life, I had spoken my complete truth to the people who needed to hear it most. The drama queen had finally refused to perform. In the weeks following my confrontation, my family launched what I can only describe as a coordinated campaign to rewrite the history of my medical ordeal. It was subtle at first, then increasingly obvious as they realized I wasn't going to quietly accept their revised narrative. My mother began the revisionism during a phone call with her sister, my Aunt Patricia, while I was in the kitchen making lunch. Her voice carried clearly through the house as she spoke with the careful authority of someone establishing an official record. Of course, we always suspected it might be neurological, she was saying, but the doctors kept insisting it was anxiety-related. We pushed for specialists, but you know how the medical system can be. We finally found Dr. Okafor, who was able to give us the answers we'd been seeking all along. I stopped preparing my sandwich and listened in disbelief. We pushed for specialists? She had actively resisted every suggestion for neurological evaluation. We had been seeking answers? They had been seeking confirmation of their preconceived psychological explanations. When I confronted her about this revision after she hung up, my mother's response was defensive but revealing. "Sage, I wasn't lying," she said, her voice carrying that particular tone parents use when they're being caught in inconsistencies by their children. "We were concerned about you. We did want answers." "You wanted specific answers," I corrected. "You wanted confirmation that my episodes were behavioral. When Miss Blackwell suggested neurological evaluation, you shut it down. When paramedics recommended hospital transport, you refused. That's not pushing for specialists." "We were protecting you from unnecessary medical procedures," she insisted, but her conviction was wavering. Dr. Hayes assured us that extensive testing would be traumatic and unproductive. My father's version of revisionism was more systematic and somehow more infuriating. During a family barbecue with extended relatives, he presented what amounted to a complete reframe of the previous decade. "We always knew Sage was dealing with something complex," he told my Uncle Donovan and several cousins. "The challenge was finding doctors who would take her symptoms seriously. Too many physicians were quick to dismiss teenage girls' medical concerns. We had to advocate continuously for proper evaluation." The audacity was breathtaking. He was positioning himself as my medical advocate, the parent who had fought against dismissive doctors, when he had been the primary force preventing me from receiving appropriate care. "That's interesting, Dad," I said, joining the conversation, "because I remember you telling Dr. Walsh at the emergency department that multiple doctors had confirmed my episodes were behavioral. That doesn't sound like advocating for proper evaluation." An uncomfortable silence settled over the group. My relatives, who had witnessed years of family discussions about my attention-seeking behavior, were clearly confused by this new narrative. Uncle Donovan, perhaps feeling defensive about his own role in misdiagnosis, attempted to support my parents' revision. "Complex medical conditions can be challenging to identify," he said with professional authority. "Your parents were working with the best information available at the time." "The best information from one family physician," I replied, "who never referred me to specialists despite years of ongoing symptoms. That's not comprehensive medical evaluation, that's medical negligence." My siblings joined the revisionist project in their own ways. Caspian, whose pre-med training made him acutely aware of how wrong the family had been, tried to minimize his own participation in dismissing my symptoms. "I always thought there might be something medical going on," he told his girlfriend during a family dinner. "But I was just a kid. I had to defer to our parents' judgment and the doctors they consulted." "You called me drama queen," I reminded him. "You suggested I was putting on performances. You were in pre-med, you knew what seizure symptoms looked like, but you chose to ignore them when they were happening in our living room." Izzy's approach was more emotional, but equally revisionist. She began telling friends that the family had always been supportive of Sage's medical journey, conveniently forgetting years of eye-rolling and irritation during my episodes. "It was so hard watching Sage struggle with undiagnosed epilepsy," I overheard her telling a friend. "We all wanted to help, but the doctors kept giving us wrong information." The collective memory reconstruction was so comprehensive that I began to wonder if I was the one misremembering. Had there been more medical advocacy than I recalled? Had my parents been more supportive than my memories suggested? But then I found my seizure diary, filled with months of carefully documented episodes and family responses. The evidence was undeniable. Dismissal, minimization, accusations of attention-seeking behavior. No advocacy, no pushing for specialists, no recognition that I might be dealing with a serious neurological condition. The final straw came when my mother began sharing her advocacy journey with other parents in our community. She spoke at a PTA meeting about the importance of persisting when children have unexplained medical symptoms. "Don't let doctors dismiss your concerns," she advised a room full of parents. "Trust your instincts. Keep pushing for answers. That's how we finally got Sage's epilepsy diagnosed." The hypocrisy was stunning. She was now presenting herself as an example of persistent parental advocacy, warning others against the very dismissive behavior she had exhibited for nearly a decade. When I confronted her about this latest revision, her response revealed the full scope of their revisionist project. "Sage, we're trying to help other families avoid what we went through," she said. "Our experience can provide valuable guidance to other parents dealing with similar situations." "Your experience of dismissing medical symptoms for 10 years?" I asked. "That's the guidance you want to share?" "Our experience of navigating a complex medical system that wasn't responsive to our concerns," she corrected, as if repetition could make her revision true. I realized then that my family's revisionism wasn't just about making themselves feel better about past failures. It was about maintaining their identity as competent parents, medical advocates, people who had done everything right under difficult circumstances. The truth? That they had been medically neglectful, that their dismissal had potentially endangered my health, that their decade of invalidation had caused significant psychological harm, was too threatening to their self-image to acknowledge directly. So they reconstructed history, turning dismissal into advocacy, negligence into concern, and resistance to proper medical care into a struggle against an unresponsive healthcare system. But I had documentation, I had witnesses, I had medical professionals who understood exactly what had happened and why it was problematic. I wouldn't let them rewrite my story to absolve themselves of responsibility for nearly a decade of medical gaslighting. The moment I realized I needed to establish firm boundaries with my family came during what I thought was a routine follow-up appointment with Dr. Okafor. I was now 3 months seizure-free on the lamotrigine, and we were discussing the possibility of returning to driving and other normal activities. "I'm pleased with your progress," Dr. Okafor said, reviewing my latest EEG results. "The medication is working beautifully. However, I want to discuss something that concerns me from a holistic treatment perspective." I straightened in my chair, worried that there might be complications I hadn't anticipated. "You've mentioned several times that your family is still struggling to accept the reality of your diagnosis," she continued. "They're making revisionist statements about their past behavior, attempting to minimize their role in delaying your treatment. From a mental health standpoint, this ongoing invalidation could undermine your recovery." Her observation hit like a revelation. I had been so focused on managing my epilepsy medically that I hadn't fully processed how my family's continued denial was affecting my psychological well-being. "What they're doing has a name," Dr. Okafor explained. "It's called medical gaslighting, and when it comes from family members, it can be particularly damaging. You spent 10 years learning to doubt your own perceptions about your body. Now that we've validated those perceptions medically, it's crucial that you don't allow anyone to undermine that validation." She leaned forward, her expression serious. "Sage, you need to protect your mental health as carefully as we're protecting your neurological health. That may require setting boundaries with family members who continue to engage in revisionist behavior." That afternoon, I drove home with Dr. Okafor's words echoing in my mind. I realized that my family's attempts to rewrite history weren't just annoying, they were actively harmful to my recovery and my relationship with my own medical reality. The opportunity to establish boundaries came that evening during another family dinner, where my parents continued their revisionist narrative in front of my grandmother Estelle. "We always suspected there might be a neurological component," my father was telling her. "But finding the right specialist who would take teenage girls' symptoms seriously was challenging. We're just grateful we persisted until we found Dr. Okafor." "Actually, Dad, we need to stop having this conversation," I said, setting down my fork with deliberate precision. "I'm not going to participate in rewriting the history of my medical treatment anymore." The table fell silent. My parents exchanged glances, clearly unprepared for direct resistance to their narrative revision. "Sage, we're not rewriting anything," my mother said defensively. "We're simply sharing our perspective on a difficult situation." "Your perspective contradicts documented facts," I replied, my voice steady but firm. "And Dr. Okafor has explained that ongoing invalidation of my medical experience could be harmful to my recovery, so I'm establishing some boundaries." I pulled out a folded piece of paper from my pocket, notes I'd prepared after my appointment with Dr. Okafor. "From now on, I won't participate in conversations where anyone claims you advocated for neurological evaluation. You didn't. I won't listen to assertions that you pushed for specialists. You didn't. I won't tolerate any narrative that positions you as medical advocates who were frustrated by an unresponsive healthcare system. That's not what happened." My family stared at me in stunned silence. "Furthermore," I continued, "I won't attend family gatherings where my medical history is discussed inaccurately in front of relatives or family friends. I won't participate in situations where you present yourselves as examples of persistent parental advocacy. And I won't tolerate any narrative that positions you as medical advocates who were frustrated by an unresponsive healthcare system. That's not what happened." My family stared at me in stunned silence. "Furthermore," I continued, "I won't attend family gatherings where my medical history is discussed inaccurately in front of relatives or family friends. I won't participate in situations where you present yourselves as examples of persistent parental advocacy. And I won't engage with any attempts to minimize the decade of medical dismissal I experienced." These seem like harsh boundaries, my grandmother Estelle observed, though her tone suggested curiosity rather than criticism. They're necessary boundaries, I replied. Dr. Okafor explained that protecting my mental health is as important as managing my epilepsy. Continuing to engage with revisionist narratives about my medical experience could undermine my recovery. My father's insurance adjuster instincts engaged, as they always did when he felt cornered. What exactly do you want from us, Sage? We've apologized. We're supporting your treatment. What more can we do? I want honesty, I said simply. Acknowledge that you dismissed my symptoms for 10 years. Acknowledge that you resisted neurological evaluation. Acknowledge that your approach was medically harmful. Stop trying to reframe your actions as advocacy when they were actually obstacles to my receiving appropriate care. And if we can't do that, my mother asked, her voice tight with defensive anger. Then we'll have limited contact until you can, I replied. My relationship with my own medical reality is too important to compromise for the sake of family harmony. The silence that followed was heavy with implications. For the first time in my life, I was prioritizing my own well-being over my family's emotional comfort. I was refusing to participate in dynamics that required me to minimize my experiences for their benefit. I think Sage is being wise, my grandmother Estelle said, finally, surprising everyone. Medical trauma is real trauma. If acknowledging the truth about what happened is too threatening to your self-image as parents, then you're asking Sage to sacrifice her healing for your comfort. That's not fair. Her support meant everything. Here was someone who had witnessed the entire decade of dismissal, who could validate my memories against their revisionist attempts. I love all of you, I said, my voice softening slightly, but I won't sacrifice my mental health to protect you from the consequences of your choices. If you want a relationship with me moving forward, it needs to be based on honesty about what actually happened, not comfortable fiction about what you wish had happened. As I left the dinner table that evening, I felt something I hadn't experienced before, the power that comes from protecting yourself, even from people you love. Setting boundaries wasn't about punishing my family, it was about creating space for my own healing and ensuring that their continued denial couldn't undo the progress I'd made. I was learning to direct her own story. 6 months seizure-free marked more than just medical progress. It marked the beginning of my transformation from victim to advocate. The clarity that came with proper treatment wasn't just neurological, it was emotional and purposeful. For the first time in my life, I understood exactly what I was meant to do with my experience. The realization began during a routine appointment with Dr. Okafor, when she mentioned that she was presenting a case study about medical gaslighting in young women at an upcoming neurology conference. "I've been thinking about including your case," she said, reviewing my latest test results. "Your documentation of symptoms, the decade-long delay in diagnosis, and your family's dismissive response, it's unfortunately representative of a much larger problem in medicine." The idea of my experience being used to educate other medical professionals felt both validating and purposeful. "I'd be honored to have my case help other doctors recognize these patterns," I said. "Actually," Dr. Okafor continued, "I was wondering if you might consider co-presenting with me. Your perspective as the patient would be invaluable. Too often, these discussions happen without including the voices of people who've actually experienced medical dismissal." The suggestion terrified and excited me in equal measure. Speaking publicly about my medical journey would mean owning my story completely, using my voice to prevent others from experiencing what I had endured. That night, I called Phoenix to discuss Dr. Okafor's invitation. Phoenix, now in college but still my closest ally, was characteristically direct in her response. "You have to do it," she said immediately. "Sage, you documented everything. You advocated for yourself when no one else would. You have proof of how badly the system failed you. If you don't speak up, how many other teenagers are going to have seizures dismissed as drama?" Her words crystallized something that had been forming in my mind for months. My experience wasn't just personal trauma. It was evidence of systemic problems in how medical professionals, families, and society treat young women's health concerns. I accepted Dr. Okafor's invitation. Preparing for the presentation required me to revisit my seizure diary, my documentation of family responses, and the timeline of medical dismissal in forensic detail. What I discovered was even more disturbing than I had realized. The patterns were clear, predictable, and inexcusable. For 10 years, every adult authority figure in my life, parents, teachers, doctors, psychologists, had defaulted to psychological explanations for neurological symptoms. Not one had insisted on comprehensive neurological evaluation. Not one had questioned why psychological interventions consistently failed to improve my condition. The neurology conference was held in Chicago with an audience of several hundred medical professionals. As I stood at the podium beside Dr. Okafor, looking out at a sea of physicians, I felt the weight of representation. I wasn't just sharing my story. I was speaking for every young woman whose medical symptoms had been dismissed as emotional, behavioral, or psychological. "My name is Sage Mirren," I began, my voice steady despite my racing heart. For 10 years, I was called drama queen by my family, attention-seeking by school officials, and conversion disorder by mental health professionals. In reality, I was having temporal lobe seizures that could have been diagnosed with a single EEG. The presentation lasted 45 minutes. I walked through the timeline of my symptoms, the family's responses, the medical professional's assumptions, and the eventual correct diagnosis. I showed slides of my seizure diary entries, demonstrating the consistent patterns that should have been recognized as neurological rather than psychological. But the most powerful moment came during the question and answer session. A pediatric neurologist in the audience stood up and asked, "What could healthcare providers have done differently to prevent this decade-long delay in diagnosis?" "Listen to patients," I replied immediately. When a teenager tells you she's experiencing specific physical symptoms, aura, automatisms, post-ictal confusion, don't assume she's making it up or exaggerating. Refer to specialists instead of defaulting to psychological explanations. And most importantly, when psychological interventions don't work, consider that you might have the wrong diagnosis entirely. The response to the presentation was overwhelming. Dozens of medical professionals approached me afterward, sharing stories of similar cases they'd encountered or asking for resources about recognizing medical gaslighting. Several mentioned that they would be changing their practice patterns based on what they'd heard. Dr. Sarah Chen, a pediatric neurologist from Seattle, was particularly moved by the presentation. "We need more patient voices in medical education," she told me. "Would you consider speaking at other conferences? I know colleagues who would benefit from hearing your perspective." Within 6 months, I was speaking at medical conferences across the country. My message was consistent. Young women's medical symptoms deserve serious evaluation. Psychological explanations shouldn't be default assumptions, and patient documentation should be valued as important clinical information. His medical perspective had also proved valuable in helping other family members understand the seriousness of what had happened. When relatives made dismissive comments about my advocacy work or suggested I should move on from past grievances, Caspian could explain in medical terms why delayed epilepsy diagnosis was dangerous and traumatic. My sister Izzy, now in college studying social work, had perhaps the most emotionally honest response to our family's history. Her artistic sensitivity, which had once made her uncomfortable with my episodes, now made her acutely aware of the psychological damage that years of invalidation had caused. "I can't believe we made you feel like you were crazy," she said during one particularly difficult conversation. "I can't believe I rolled my eyes at you when you were having seizures." Her guilt was sometimes overwhelming, but it had motivated her to become involved with my advocacy work. She'd helped design educational materials about recognizing medical gaslighting and had even spoken at a few conferences about the impact of family dismissal on patients' psychological well-being. My grandmother Estelle remained my strongest family ally, though at 85, her health was beginning to decline. She'd always been the one person who questioned the psychological explanations for my episodes, and now she took satisfaction in having her instincts validated. I always knew those episodes weren't behavioral, she reminded me regularly. I just wish I'd been braver about challenging your parents' assumptions. Uncle Donovan had perhaps the most difficult adjustment to make. As a mental health professional, his misdiagnosis of my condition represented not just a personal failure, but a professional one. He'd initially responded to my advocacy work with defensive criticism, suggesting that I was overcomplicating what had been a reasonable clinical assessment. It took a presentation by Dr. Okafor at a psychology conference, one specifically about distinguishing neurological symptoms from conversion disorders, to shift his perspective. He finally acknowledged that his psychological assessment of my episodes had been incorrect and potentially harmful. I should have insisted on neurological consultation before concluding your symptoms were conversion-based, he admitted during a stiff but sincere conversation. That was a failure of clinical judgment on my part. The relationship that surprised me most was with my extended family. Cousins, aunts, and uncles who had witnessed years of family gatherings where my episodes were dismissed as attention-seeking behavior now approached me with a mixture of concern and curiosity. Some apologized for not speaking up when they'd had doubts about the family narrative. Others asked questions about medical gaslighting and whether they might have similar blind spots in their own families. The most meaningful relationships, however, were the ones I'd built outside my biological family. Phoenix remained my closest friend, now working as a nurse practitioner with a special interest in patient advocacy. Dr. Okafor had become more than my neurologist. She was a collaborator and mentor who continued to support my advocacy work. Through my speaking engagements and blog, I'd connected with hundreds of people who'd experienced similar medical dismissal. These connections had created a chosen family of sorts, people who understood the unique trauma of having your symptoms invalidated by those who should have protected and believed you. The epilepsy community had embraced me as well. I'd become involved with several national organizations, serving on patient advisory boards, and helping to develop resources for people dealing with delayed diagnosis. 2 years seizure-free, with relationships rebuilt on honesty rather than comfortable fiction, I finally understood what healthy family dynamics could look like. Not everyone had been willing or able to engage with the difficult truths about our past, but those who had were now part of more authentic, supportive relationships than I'd ever known were possible. The drama queen had found her real family, some biological, some chosen, all genuine. Sitting in my office at the Denver Neurological Institute today, 3 years seizure-free and surrounded by the patient advocacy program that grew from my pain, I often think about what I wish I could tell that 17-year-old girl who was lying in her bedroom wondering if she was crazy. The most important thing I would tell her is this: your body is not lying to you. When something feels wrong, when symptoms persist despite being dismissed, when your lived experience contradicts everyone else's explanations, trust yourself. Your perceptions matter. Your pain is real. Your voice deserves to be heard. But the transformation went beyond speaking engagements. I began volunteering with epilepsy advocacy organizations, helping to develop resources for patients dealing with misdiagnosis. I started a blog called Dismissed: Stories of Medical Gaslighting, which became a platform for people to share their experiences of having symptoms minimized or attributed to psychological causes. Most importantly, I began working with Dr. Okafor on research projects examining the prevalence of delayed epilepsy diagnosis in young women. Our preliminary findings were disturbing. Girls were 3 times more likely than boys to have seizure symptoms attributed to psychological causes, leading to significantly longer delays in appropriate treatment. The girl who had been called drama queen for a decade was becoming a voice for medical advocacy and systemic change. My seizure diary, once a desperate attempt to validate my own experience, was now helping to educate healthcare providers about recognizing neurological symptoms in young patients. Every time I spoke at a conference, every blog post I published, every conversation with a medical professional who reconsidered their assumptions about teenage girls' symptoms, it all felt like reclaiming power from the decade of dismissal I'd endured. I had found my purpose in the pain, transforming medical trauma into advocacy that might prevent others from experiencing the same systemic failures that had defined my adolescence. I had become a powerful voice for change. 2 years after my diagnosis, the landscape of my family relationships had evolved in ways I never could have predicted. The boundaries I'd established hadn't driven everyone away. Instead, they had created space for more authentic connections with those willing to engage honestly, while naturally limiting contact with those who remained committed to revisionist narratives. My relationship with my father had undergone the most dramatic transformation. After months of resistance to my boundaries, he surprised me by scheduling a private lunch where he came prepared with a written list of acknowledgments. "I've been thinking about what you said about wanting honesty," he began, pulling out a folded paper. "I've written down what I think I need to say, and I want to make sure I get it right." The list was thorough and painful. Acknowledgement that he had dismissed my symptoms for 10 years, that he had refused neurological evaluation against medical advice, that he had contributed to my psychological trauma through his skepticism and the drama queen nickname. But most importantly, he acknowledged that his behavior had been medically harmful and potentially dangerous. "I was wrong," he said, his insurance adjuster composure completely absent. "Not just mistaken, wrong. And I'm sorry for the decade of pain I caused by refusing to listen to you." This honesty opened the door to a relationship I'd never imagined possible. We began meeting monthly for coffee, discussions that were deeper and more genuine than any conversations we'd had during my childhood. He asked thoughtful questions about my advocacy work and seemed genuinely interested in understanding medical gaslighting as a systemic problem. My mother's journey was more complicated. She had initially responded to my boundaries with anger and hurt feelings, interpreting my requests for honesty as personal attacks on her parenting. For several months, we had minimal contact. The breakthrough came when she attended one of my conference presentations without telling me. Afterward, she approached me with tears in her eyes. "I didn't understand what you were trying to tell us," she said. "Hearing you speak to those doctors, seeing their reactions, I finally grasped how serious this was, how wrong we were." Our relationship now existed in a careful middle ground. She had acknowledged the medical dismissal and apologized sincerely, but she still struggled with the emotional weight of recognizing her role in my decade of suffering. Our conversations were warmer than they'd been in years, but there remained an underlying sadness about time and trust that couldn't be fully recovered. Caspian, now completing his medical residency, had become something close to an ally. His medical training gave him a framework for understanding exactly how problematic our family's approach had been. He'd incorporated my story into presentations about pediatric neurology and diagnostic bias, using our family's mistakes as teaching examples for other medical students. "I wish I'd spoken up more when we were kids," he told me during a recent visit. "I knew something wasn't right about how you were being treated, but I was too focused on my own success to advocate for you." But I would also tell her that validation might not come from the people she most desperately wants it from. Sometimes the people who should believe you first, family, primary care doctors, school officials, are the least equipped to see what's actually happening. That doesn't mean you stop advocating for yourself. It means you find other voices, other allies, other sources of validation. Document everything. Keep records not because you doubt yourself, but because others will doubt you. When I started my seizure diary, I thought I was trying to understand my condition. I didn't realize I was building a legal case for my own medical reality. That documentation became the foundation of my diagnosis, my advocacy work, and my ability to resist family revisionism. Understand that medical gaslighting is systemic, not personal. When doctors dismiss your symptoms as psychological, when they assume you're exaggerating or attention-seeking, it's often because medical education has blind spots around women's health, adolescent complaints, and conditions that don't fit obvious patterns. Their dismissal says more about their training and biases than it does about your credibility as a patient. Learn the language of advocacy. Phrases like, "I need this documented in my medical record," and "I want to see a specialist regardless of your assessment," carry weight in medical settings. "I'm not comfortable with that diagnosis without further testing" is a complete sentence that doesn't require justification. You have the right to seek second opinions, to request referrals, to insist on appropriate diagnostic workups. Most importantly, learn to separate your self-worth from other people's ability to understand your experience. I spent 10 years believing that if I could just explain my symptoms clearly enough, document them thoroughly enough, behave appropriately enough, my family would finally believe me. But their inability to see my medical reality was never about my presentation, it was about their limitations. Your value as a person isn't determined by whether others can validate your experiences. You don't need permission to know what's happening in your own body. For parents listening to this story, I want you to consider how you respond when your child reports persistent, unusual symptoms. Ask yourself, am I listening with an open mind, or am I looking for confirmation of what I already believe? Am I advocating for comprehensive evaluation, or am I accepting the first explanation that feels manageable? When psychological causes are suggested for your child's physical symptoms, insist on ruling out medical causes first. When your child says something is wrong with their body, believe them. When symptoms don't improve with psychological interventions, consider that you might have the wrong diagnosis entirely. For healthcare providers, remember that young women are historically undertreated and underbelieved in medical settings. When a teenage girl reports neurological symptoms, don't default to psychological explanations. Order the EEG, refer to the specialist, take detailed histories, and most importantly, listen to the patient as the primary source of information about their own experience. To anyone currently dealing with medical dismissal, you are not alone. Your symptoms matter. Your experience is valid. Keep advocating, keep documenting, keep seeking appropriate care. Find healthcare providers who listen. Build a support system of people who believe you. And remember that healing is possible, both medically and emotionally. The girl they called drama queen for 10 years is now helping to change how medical professionals understand and respond to young women's health concerns. The symptoms that were dismissed as attention-seeking are now part of research that's improving diagnoses for other patients. The documentation that was once evidence of my desperation is now educational material that helps doctors recognize temporal lobe epilepsy more quickly. Your pain can become purpose. Your experience can prevent others from suffering the same dismissal. Your voice can contribute to systemic change that makes medical care more equitable and responsive. But first and most importantly, your voice matters right now, for you, regardless of any larger purpose it might serve. You deserve to be heard, believed, and appropriately treated. You deserve medical care that takes your symptoms seriously. You deserve a family that listens when you say something is wrong. Trust yourself. Advocate for yourself. Document everything. Find allies. Seek appropriate care. And remember that the people who dismiss you don't determine your worth. The drama queen learned to direct her own story, and you can learn to direct yours too.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.